The DJ heard a voice at 2:47 a.m. that shouldn't have been there. It bled through the static, faint but desperate. Mayday coordinates are wrong. No one's coming. He recorded it. For 45 years, the tape sat in a box. Then someone pressed play and realized the voice belonged to a pilot who'd been missing since 1978, and the coordinates he'd given rescue teams had been 14 miles off. The radio station was KMTN-AM, a small independent broadcaster in Havre, Montana. Power, 5,000 watts. Range 60 miles on a clear night. Format, country music, local news, farm reports. The station had been on the air since 1954, broadcasting from a squat brick building on the edge of town. The tower was a quarter-mile away, a 180-foot steel lattice that blinked red at night. The DJ was named Ray Callahan. He was 29 in 1979, 6 years into the overnight shift, midnight to 6 a.m. 6 nights a week. Ray liked the quiet. He liked the music. He liked being alone in the building, spinning records, reading the news, taking the occasional call from a trucker or a rancher who couldn't sleep. Ray's shift on the night of March 17, 1979 was routine. He played Waylon Jennings, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson. He read the ag report at 1 a.m. He took a call from a listener in Chinook who wanted to hear Merle Haggard. Ray played Okie from Muskogee and settled back into his chair. At 2:47 a.m., Ray was queuing up the next song when he heard something strange. A voice, faint and broken, coming through his headphones. It wasn't on the phone line. It wasn't on the station's frequency. It was somewhere else, bleeding through, like a signal from another world. Ray stopped. He adjusted the headphones. The voice came again, clearer this time. Mayday. Fuel critical coordinates are wrong. No one's coming. Ray's heart kicked. He grabbed a blank cassette tape, slid it into the recorder, and hit record. The voice continued, fading in and out, through waves of static. Mayday. This is November 47 Bravo Charlie. Engine failing. Gave coordinates to tower, they're wrong. 14 miles north. Repeat, 14 miles north of reported position. Ray leaned forward, straining to hear. The voice was male, mid-30s maybe, clipped and precise, despite the fear underneath. A pilot, calling for help, but on the wrong frequency. The voice crackled. Going down near ridge, can see lights below descending fast. If anyone hears this, then static, pure, unbroken static. Ray sat frozen for 10 seconds. Then he rewound the tape and played it back. The voice was there, clear enough to make out the words. Mayday, November 47 Bravo Charlie, 14 miles north. Ray grabbed the phone and called the station manager, a man named Ed Vasquez. Ed's home number rang 6 times before he answered, groggy and annoyed. This better be good, Ray. Ray said. I just recorded something on air. A Mayday call. A pilot. He said his coordinates were wrong. Ed was silent for a moment. Then he said, what are you talking about? Ray explained. The voice, the static, the call sign, the coordinates. Ed listened without interrupting. When Ray finished, Ed said, play it for me tomorrow. If it's real, we'll call the FAA. Ray said, shouldn't we call now? Ed said, Ray, it's 3 in the morning. If a plane went down tonight, someone else already knows about it. Play the tape for me at 6 a.m. We'll figure it out then. Ed hung up. Ray sat in the booth, staring at the cassette recorder. He thought about calling the FAA himself, but what would he say? He didn't know where the signal had come from. He didn't know when the plane had gone down. He didn't even know if the voice was current, or some weird atmospheric bounce from an old transmission. Ray finished his shift. At 6 a.m., Ed walked into the station. Ray played him the tape. Ed listened twice. Then he said, That's atmospheric skip. Happens sometimes. Signals bounce off the ionosphere, travel hundreds of miles. You probably picked up a transmission from Canada or North Dakota. Ray said, but he said his coordinates were wrong. He said 14 miles north. Ed said, could be an old transmission. Could be from last week, last month. Radio waves don't disappear, Ray. They bounce around. You caught an echo. Ray said, shouldn't we at least report it? Ed sighed. Fine. I'll call the FAA. But don't get your hopes up. Ed called the FAA regional office in Billings. He spoke to a duty officer. He described what Ray had recorded. The officer said he'd check recent incidents and call back. The officer called back 2 hours later. He said there were no recent Mayday calls matching that description. No missing aircraft in Montana, North Dakota, or Wyoming. No distress signals on record. He said it was probably atmospheric interference or a hoax. Ed thanked him and hung up. He looked at Ray. There you go. Nothing. Ray said, what about the call sign? November 47 Bravo Charlie. Ed said, you want to look it up? Be my guest. But I'm telling you, it's nothing. Ray didn't let it go. That afternoon, he went to the county library and asked if they had FAA aircraft registries. They didn't. So Ray called the FAA back himself. He asked if they could search for a registration number, NUN 47 BC. The officer said, hold on. 3 minutes later, the officer came back. That's a Cessna 182, registered to a guy named Thomas Merrick, based out of Bozeman. Ray's pulse jumped. Is it missing? The officer said, not that I see, but let me check something. He put Ray on hold again. 5 minutes passed. Then the officer returned. Okay, this is weird. That aircraft was reported missing in December 1978. Merrick was flying from Bozeman to Great Falls. He never arrived. Search teams looked for 2 weeks. Found nothing. Case is still open, but it's been cold for months. Ray said, the voice I recorded said his coordinates were wrong. 14 miles north of the reported position. The officer said, reported position was 46.3 north, 111.7 west. That's near the gates of the mountains, north of Helena. If he was 14 miles north of that, he'd be near, hold on, let me calculate, around the Scapegoat Wilderness area. Pretty remote, heavy timber, steep ridges. Ray said, did the search teams check there? The officer said, if the coordinates were wrong, no, they searched the area he radioed. But if he miscalculated, or if his instruments were off, they could have been looking in the wrong place. Ray said, so he could still be out there. The officer said maybe, but winter's brutal in that area. If he went down in December, survival odds are near zero. Ray thanked him and hung up. He sat in the station booth, staring at the cassette tape. Thomas Merrick, missing since December 1978, 3 months ago, and somehow his voice had bled through KMTN's frequency in March 1979. Ray called Ed and told him. Ed said, that doesn't make sense. If the plane went down in December, how are you hearing a Mayday call in March? Ray said, I don't know, but we have to tell someone. Ed said, I'll call the FAA again, but Ray, don't get obsessed with this. You did your part. Ed called the FAA. The officer said he'd pass the information to the search and rescue coordinator. But he was skeptical. He said atmospheric anomalies could make old transmissions sound recent. He said there was no way to verify when the Mayday had been sent. The FAA didn't reopen the search. Thomas Merrick remained missing. The tape sat in KMTN's archive, labeled March 17, 1979, unknown Mayday signal. Ray Callahan left KMTN in 1981. He moved to Billings, worked at a larger station, eventually got out of radio altogether. He became a high school English teacher. He married, had 2 kids, lived a quiet life, but he never forgot the voice. Every few years, he'd think about Thomas Merrick and wonder if anyone had ever found him. 45 years passed. In 2024, KMTN AM was still on the air, though barely. The station had changed ownership 3 times since the 1980s. It now broadcast a mix of classic country, talk radio, and syndicated programming. The staff had turned over completely. No one who worked there in 2024 had worked there in 1979. In June 2024, the station hired a part-time archivist named Lena Cross. Lena was 26, a recent graduate of the University of Montana, with a degree in media studies. Her job was to digitize KMTN's old recordings, decades of tapes, reels, and cassettes stored in boxes in the station's basement. Lena set up a workstation in a corner of the basement. She had a cassette player, a digital converter, and a laptop. She worked 3 days a week, transferring recordings, labeling files, uploading them to a cloud server. Most of the tapes were mundane. Old newscasts, farm reports, weather updates. But Lena enjoyed the work. It was like archaeology, digging through layers of sound, uncovering forgotten voices. On August 14, 2024, Lena pulled a box labeled 1979, MISC. Inside were 23 cassette tapes, each labeled with a date and a brief description. One tape caught her eye. The label read, March 17, 1979, Unknown Mayday Signal, Ray Callahan. Lena loaded the tape into the player and pressed play. For the first 30 seconds there was nothing but static. Then a voice emerged, faint and broken. Mayday. Fuel critical. Coordinates are wrong. No one's coming. Lena froze. She rewound the tape and listened again. The voice was clear enough. A pilot calling for help, saying his coordinates were wrong. Lena grabbed her phone and took notes as she listened. She wrote down every word she could make out. Then she played the tape a 3rd time, this time using audio editing software to filter out some of the static. With the static reduced, the voice was even clearer. Mayday, this is November 47 Bravo Charlie. Engine failing. Gave coordinates to tower. They're wrong. 14 miles north. Repeat. 14 miles north of reported position, going down near ridge. Can see lights below, descending fast. If anyone hears this. Lena saved the cleaned-up audio file and uploaded it to the cloud. Then she Googled November 47 Bravo Charlie. The first result was an FAA incident report from 1978. Aircraft registration N47BC. A Cessna 182. Pilot Thomas Merrick, age 34. Missing since December 18, 1978. Last known position, approximately 46.3 north, 111.7 west, near the gates of the mountains wilderness. Search conducted December 19, 31, 1978. No wreckage found. Case status, open, inactive. Lena read the report twice. Then she called her supervisor, the station manager, a woman named Karen Delgado. Lena explained what she'd found. Karen came down to the basement and listened to the tape. Karen said, "That's incredible. But how is this possible? The plane went missing in December 1978. This tape is from March 1979. Lena said, "I don't know, but the voice says his coordinates were wrong. 14 miles north. Maybe the search teams were looking in the wrong place." Karen said, "We need to report this. Call the FAA." Lena called the FAA regional office in Billings. She spoke to a duty officer named Mark Torres. She explained the situation, the tape, the voice, the coordinates. Mark said he'd look into it. Mark called back an hour later. He said, "I pulled the file on N47BC. Thomas Merrick, reported missing December 1978. There's a note in the file from March 1979. Someone from KMTN AM called and reported hearing a Mayday signal that mentioned the aircraft. The FAA investigated, but found no evidence the transmission was current. They assumed it was atmospheric interference. Lena said, "But what if it wasn't? What if the coordinates really were wrong?" Mark said, "Let me check something." He put Lena on hold. 5 minutes later, he came back. "Okay, the original search area was centered on coordinates Thomas radioed to Great Falls Tower before he lost contact. But if he was 14 miles north of that position, he'd be near the Bob Marshall Wilderness, around 46.5 north, 111.8 west. That area wasn't searched." Lena said, "Why not?" Mark said, "Because the search teams had no reason to think he was there. They searched where he said he was." Lena said, "So he could still be out there." Mark said, "It's been 46 years. But yeah, the wreckage could be." Mark escalated the case to the National Transportation Safety Board. On August 20th, the NTSB assigned an investigator named Daniel Ruiz to review the file. Daniel listened to the cleaned-up audio Lena had uploaded. He read the 1978 search reports. He calculated the coordinates. On August 23rd, Daniel requested a search operation. The Montana Department of Natural Resources agreed to provide helicopter support. On August 28th, a search team deployed to the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The team included 2 helicopters, 4 ground searchers, and a drone operator. They focused on a 10-square-mile area, centered on the revised coordinates, 46.5 north, 111.8 west. The terrain was brutal. Dense forest, steep ridges, rocky outcrops. The team searched for 3 days. On August 30th, the drone operator spotted something, a metallic reflection, partially obscured by trees, on the north face of a ridge. Ground searchers hiked to the location. They found the wreckage of a small aircraft, a Cessna 182, registration N47BC. The fuselage was crumpled, the wings sheared off. The plane had hit the ridge at a steep angle, likely during a controlled descent. The cockpit was intact, but heavily damaged. Inside, they found human remains. A single occupant, male, still strapped into the pilot's seat. The remains were skeletal, scattered by animals over the years, but enough remained for identification. Forensic analysis confirmed the identity Thomas Merrick. The NTSB transported the wreckage to a facility in Helena. Investigators examined the cockpit instruments. They found the radio, still tuned to 121.5 MHz, the emergency frequency. But the frequency dial was slightly off-center, suggesting it had been bumped or misadjusted during the crash. Daniel Ruiz reviewed the evidence and filed a report on September 10, 2024. His conclusion: Thomas Merrick had experienced engine failure on December 18, 1978, while flying from Bozeman to Great Falls. He'd radioed his position to the tower, but his instruments had been malfunctioning. The coordinates he'd given were 14 miles south of his actual location. When he realized the error, he'd tried to correct it, broadcasting a Mayday on the emergency frequency. But the signal hadn't reached the tower. It had been too weak, or the frequency had been slightly off. Instead, the signal had bounced through the atmosphere and been picked up by KMTN-AM in Havre on March 17, 1979, 3 months after the crash. Daniel's report noted that atmospheric skip could cause radio signals to travel unpredictable distances and appear at unexpected times. The signal Ray Callahan had recorded in March 1979 was likely a delayed echo of Thomas Merrick's final Mayday, transmitted in December 1978, but not received until months later. The report was released to the public on September 15th. News outlets picked up the story. Ray Callahan, now 74 and retired in Billings, saw the coverage on TV. He called Lena Cross at KMTN. "I knew that voice was real," Ray said. "I knew it." Lena said, "You did everything you could. You reported it. It's not your fault they didn't find him." Ray said, But I heard him. I heard him say the coordinates were wrong, and no one listened. Lena said, they listened, they just didn't believe it was possible. Ray was silent for a moment. Then he said, do you think he knew? Do you think he knew his Mayday wasn't getting through? Lena said, I don't know. But he kept transmitting. He kept trying. That's what matters. On September 20th, Thomas Merrick's remains were returned to his family. He was buried in Bozeman on September 25th. His wife Margaret, now 79, attended the service along with their 2 children, both in their 50s. Margaret had never remarried. She'd spent 46 years not knowing where her husband was. At the service, Margaret spoke briefly. She said Thomas had been a careful pilot, meticulous about safety. She said he'd flown for 20 years without incident. She said she'd always believed he was out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. I just wish someone had listened, Margaret said quietly. Someone did listen. A DJ in Havre heard Thomas's voice. He recorded it. He reported it. But no one believed him. And so Thomas stayed out there, alone, for 46 years. After the service, a reporter asked Margaret how she felt about the delay. Margaret said, I'm grateful they found him, but I'm angry it took so long. Because someone knew, someone heard, and nothing was done. The reporter asked if she blamed Ray Callahan. Margaret shook her head. No, he did what he could. I blame the system that didn't take him seriously. Lena Cross attended the service. Afterward, she spoke to Margaret privately. She said, I'm sorry it took so long to find him. Margaret said, you found him. That's what matters. Lena said, I just digitized a tape. Margaret said, and because you did, my husband has a grave. He has a headstone. He's not lost anymore. Thank you. Lena went back to Havre and continued her work. She digitized hundreds more tapes over the next 6 months. Most were mundane, but every time she loaded a new cassette, she wondered what other voices might be waiting, unheard, in the static. On December 18, 2024, 46 years to the day after Thomas Merrick's crash, the NTSB held a press conference. Daniel Ruiz presented the final report. He said the crash had been caused by engine failure, likely due to carburetor icing. He said Thomas had done everything right. He'd tried to glide to a safe landing. He'd radioed for help. He'd given his position, but his instruments had been wrong, and his Mayday hadn't been heard. Daniel said, this case highlights the importance of accurate instrumentation and reliable communication. Thomas Merrick did everything a pilot is trained to do in an emergency, but a small error in his coordinates, combined with a weak radio signal, meant rescuers were looking in the wrong place. If the DJ in Havre had been taken seriously, if the FAA had investigated more thoroughly, Thomas might have been found in 1979, but he wasn't, and that's a failure we have to learn from. A reporter asked if atmospheric skip was common. Daniel said, it's rare, but it happens. Radio signals can bounce off the ionosphere and travel hundreds of miles. They can be delayed by minutes, hours, even months. What Ray Callahan heard in March 1979 was likely an echo of Thomas's final transmission from December 1978. We can't explain exactly why the delay happened, but the evidence supports it. Another reporter asked why the FAA hadn't searched the revised coordinates in 1979. Daniel said, because they had no reason to believe the transmission was current. The aircraft had been missing for 3 months. They assumed it was atmospheric interference or a hoax. In hindsight, that was a mistake. The press conference ended. The case was officially closed. Thomas Merrick's death was ruled accidental. The NTSB issued recommendations for improving emergency communication protocols and search procedures. But for Ray Callahan, the case was never fully closed. He thought about that night, in March 1979, The voice in his headphones, the desperation, the plea for help. He thought about how close Thomas had come to being found. 14 miles. That was the difference between being rescued and being lost for 46 years. Ray visited Thomas's grave in Bozeman on January 10, 2025. He stood by the headstone and stared at the inscription, Thomas Merrick, 1944-1978, pilot, husband, father, finally, home. Ray whispered, "I heard you. I tried. I'm sorry it wasn't enough." He stood there for a long time. Then he left. Lena Cross finished digitizing KMTN's archive in March 2025. She'd converted over 2,000 hours of recordings. Most would never be listened to again, but they were preserved, uploaded, searchable. And somewhere in those files, there might be other voices, other Maydays, other echoes of people who'd called for help and hadn't been heard. Lena thought about Thomas Merrick often. She thought about the fragility of communication, the way a voice could travel through the air and arrive too late, or in the wrong place, or not at all. She thought about how many people had gone missing over the years, and how many might have sent a final message that no one received. On March 17, 2025, 46 years after Ray Callahan had recorded Thomas's Mayday, KMTN AIM held a memorial broadcast. They played the original tape, cleaned up, and restored. They invited Ray to speak. He declined, but he sent a statement. "I heard a voice," Ray wrote. "I recorded it. I reported it. I did what I thought was right. But it wasn't enough. And for 46 years, I've wondered if I could have done more. I don't have an answer. But I hope that by sharing this story, we can remember that every voice matters. Every call for help deserves to be heard. And every person who goes missing deserves to be found." The broadcast ended with a moment of silence. Then the station played Merle Haggard's Okie from Muskogee, the song Ray had been queuing up the night he heard Thomas's voice. And in the static between songs, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it again, a faint voice calling through the years, asking someone, anyone, to listen. If you heard a distress call on the radio, but no one believed you, would you keep fighting to be heard, or would you let it go?